The fluorescent lights above bed 7 buzzed with a thin, electrical whine that only Maya could hear, because Maya had spent the last 6 years teaching herself how to listen to the things no one else wanted to notice. It was 2 in the morning on a Tuesday in October, and the rain had been sliding down the windows of St. Vincent's Hospital since midnight, painting the glass with long, silver tears that caught the light and threw it back into the room. The smell of antiseptic was so thick it had become a kind of weather, mixing with the faint, warm scent of reheated soup from the cafeteria and the metallic tang of old blood that never quite left the floors no matter how many times they were mopped. Maya moved between the beds with a small limp, the soft hitch in her right leg something she had stopped trying to hide, because the senior nurses had stopped looking long enough to notice it anyway. Her scrubs were 2 sizes too big, faded to the color of weak tea by 100 washes, and her name badge was already peeling at the corner where the laminated photo had been pressed and repressed by too many clumsy fingers. She was 38 years old, but on the night shift she could have been a ghost, moving through the long halls of the downtown trauma center without ever quite belonging to any of the conversations that happened around her. The attending doctors walked past her as if she were a piece of furniture that they had learned to step over. The charge nurses barked orders at her as if she were a child, telling her to fetch blankets, to change IV bags, to clean up messes that were never hers but always seemed to land at the feet of the newest, quietest person on the floor. The patients barely glanced up from their phones when she entered their rooms to check their vitals, and when she spoke to them, they often answered with a thin, distracted nod, the kind of nod you give to a stranger on the street because acknowledging them is easier than apologizing for being so tired. Maya smiled through all of it every single time, because smiling had become the cheapest way she knew to make the world slide off her back like water. But the smile was a mask, and if anyone had cared to look past the soft brown eyes and the tired, kind mouth, they would have seen something else entirely. They would have seen the way her fingers wrapped around a pen with a grip that was too practiced, too deliberate, the way a person grips a weapon when they have held one so often that the muscle memory never really leaves. They would have seen the way her gaze swept every doorway she passed, the way her ears tracked every footstep in the hallway, the way her shoulders dropped just a fraction of an inch whenever a door slammed somewhere down the corridor. Maya was afraid of many things on the surface, afraid of disappointing her supervisor, afraid of losing the small apartment she could barely afford, afraid of the day her limp would finally become too much for her to climb 3 flights of stairs to her unit. But underneath all of those ordinary fears lived something else, something darker and older, something that remembered the sound of a helicopter blade slicing through the hot black sky of a desert most people had never heard of and most people would never see. 3 years earlier, on a classified night in a country that did not officially exist on any map she was allowed to study, Maya had been extracted from a burning convoy with a bullet that had shattered her femur and a shrapnel wound that had carved a long, ugly scar from her hip to her knee. She had been told that night, by a voice on a radio that was already breaking up, that her team was declared killed in action. 6 of them went into the dry riverbed that night, and only one walked out under a different name, a different face, a different life stitched together by a quiet agreement between the Department of Defense and a small clinic in Virginia where the doctors were told never to ask questions about the paperwork. Maya had walked away from the war the way a soldier walks away from a fire slowly, looking over her shoulder, half expecting the smoke to follow her home. And the smoke had followed her in a way. It lived in the limp. It lived in the limp that came back when it rained. It lived in the way she sometimes woke up with her fists clenched so tight her nails cut into her palms. Maya had chosen this life, the life of a nameless, thankless night nurse, because a nameless, thankless life was the safest kind of life a dead woman could live. Tonight, the rain was heavier than usual, and the city outside looked like it had been dipped in ink. She had been on her feet for 11 hours already, and her back ached with the dull, patient throb of someone who had stopped counting pain as anything unusual. The cafeteria had run out of the good coffee around 3 a.m., which meant the tray she was carrying now held a row of paper cups filled with a lukewarm, watery stew. Beef-stance that smelled more like rust than roast. The interns on the upper floors had left their trays by the elevator, half-drunk cups rolling slightly with every floor change, and Maya had been sent to clean them up the way she was always sent to clean things up. She bent slowly to gather them, one by one, and the breath she let out was the kind of breath a person lets out when they are trying very hard not to feel sorry for themselves. She straightened up and looked out through the tall window at the street below, where the ambulance bay was lit by a flickering yellow sign that hadn't been fixed in 5 years. If you believe that some heroes wear scrubs we never notice, please take a second to hit the like button and subscribe to our channel to join our family of hidden lifelines. Your support helps us tell the stories of those who served in silence and never asked for applause. The rain on the glass sounded like static, and for a moment Maya closed her eyes and let her mind drift back to a memory she had trained herself not to visit too often. She saw again the long, burning convoy, the shouts of men she had loved like brothers, the bright, white shock of the pain in her leg, and the strange, calm voice on the radio telling her to crawl to keep crawling, that rescue was coming, but she had to keep crawling or she would not be alive to see it. She saw the medic's face leaning down through the smoke, a young man with red hair and freckles, telling her she was going to be fine in a tone that was almost certainly a lie. She felt again the cold steel of the stretcher beneath her, the rotors above her, the strange hush of a world that had suddenly decided she was allowed to live. Then she opened her eyes, and the window was just a window again, and the city was just a city, and the cups in her hands were just paper cups full of bad coffee. She took a slow breath and walked back toward the nurse's station, where a new patient had just been admitted through the side entrance, and where a shift that had already been long was about to become something very different. The patient was a 9-year-old boy named Theo, who had been brought in under the small, narrow-eyed watch of 3 men in dark suits whose earpieces glittered faintly under the hallway lights. Theo was small for his age, with hair the soft color of autumn wheat and eyes that were too tired for the rest of his face. He had a wound above his left eyebrow that had been stitched shut by someone in a hurry, and a small cast on his right arm that had been wrapped with the kind of neat military precision that ordinary emergency rooms rarely use. His pulse was steady, his color was good, but the way he held himself, curled into a tight, quiet knot near the pillow, was the way a child holds himself when he has been running for too long and has finally been told it is okay to stop but does not quite believe it yet. The men in the dark suits did not speak to Maya directly, but one of them handed her a chart with a hand that was unusually steady, and the second one stood very close to the door as if he were the door's own personal shadow. The third one looked at Maya in a way that made her feel, for the first time in 3 years, like she was being measured. He studied her limp, her name badge, the way her hands received the chart without trembling, and something in his gaze flickered just slightly, as if he had seen something in her he had not expected to see and could not yet place. The chart said only what the chart had been cleared to say. The boy's name was Theo Reyes. He had been admitted through a special trauma channel reserved for federal witnesses and their protected family members. He had been in a safe house in New Jersey when a fire had started in the basement, and he had been pulled out through a window by a man who had caught him just before the second-story frame had collapsed onto the lawn. The fire had been set. The fire had been set by people who had made it very clear, through a small, neatly wrapped package left on the kitchen counter, that they would have preferred for Theo and his mother to not have made it out at all. The boy's mother, a woman named Anna Reyes, had survived 2 assassination attempts in the last 6 months, and she was scheduled to testify in 11 days before a federal grand jury against a man whose name Theo was not supposed to know and whose reach Theo was never supposed to feel. The man was Mateo Alarcon, the head of an organization that had been quietly dismantling families like the Reyes family for the better part of 2 decades. With the patience of a man who understood that fear, properly applied, could do more work in a year than a bullet could do in a single moment. Maya read the chart twice. She read it slowly, because reading it slowly gave her hands something to do while the rest of her mind finished the picture that her training had already started drawing for her the moment the men in the dark suits Dee walked in. The dark suits were federal agents. The way they moved was federal. The way their holsters sat high on their ribs under their jackets was federal. The way they did not take off their earpieces, the way their eyes never quite rested, the way they positioned themselves near every exit like water finding the path of least resistance, all of it was federal. But the wound on Theo's eyebrow was not the kind of wound that happens in a fire. The wound was raised, slightly curved, with a faint oval imprint at the corner that looked like the bruise left by the inside of a wedged ring. Maya had seen that bruise before. She had seen it on the heads of children pulled out of collapsed buildings in foreign countries, children who had been hit by falling debris as they ran. And she had seen it on the heads of children who had been hit, deliberately, by grown men with rings on their fingers, in apartments where the doors had been kicked in and the windows had been thrown open to let the bullets escape into the street. Something was wrong with this picture, and Maya could feel it the way an animal feels an incoming storm, deep in the bones, before the sky has begun to change color. If you think you know what is about to happen to this quiet boy and his quiet nurse, hit the like button right now and subscribe, because what happens next is the kind of moment you do not want to miss. 2 hours later, the boy was sleeping soundly in a private room on the fourth floor, and Maya was sitting at the small, battered nurse's station just outside his door, pretending to fill out paperwork that no one was ever going to read. The senior nurse on duty, a tired woman named Dolers who had been at St. Vincent's for 26 years, had gone home sick at midnight, leaving Maya alone on the floor with one other nurse, a young man named Ben who had been working at the hospital for less time than Maya and who was currently in the supply closet trying to figure out why his insulin pen had suddenly stopped working. The federal agents had shifted their positions slightly, with one posted outside the door and the other two making slow, patient loops down the corridor and back. The third agent, the one who had studied Maya so carefully, was sitting at the far end of the hallway in a plastic chair that squeaked every time he shifted his weight, talking into his earpiece in a voice so low that Maya could not quite make out the words but could hear the cadence. He was waiting for someone. He was waiting the way a man waits when he knows the person he is waiting for does not always arrive when they say they will. Maya's hands were steady as she wrote. They had always been steady, even when the rest of her was on fire. She thought of Theo, sleeping in the small bed down the hall, and she thought about how he had held her hand when she had changed his bandages earlier, gripping her fingers with a strength that surprised her, as if the child had somehow known that her hand was a different kind of hand than the hands of the doctors and nurses who had come before her. She thought about how, when she had asked him about the wound above his eyebrow, the boy had looked at her for a long moment and then said in a quiet, careful voice that he had tripped. He had tripped on the way down the stairs. He had tripped and hit his head on the railing. Maya had nodded and smiled and said that she was sorry he had tripped, and the boy had nodded back, and the silence between them had said everything their voices would not. Maya had tucked him in and told him that he was safe now, and the boy had asked her in a small voice if safe was a real thing, and Maya had told him very gently that safe was the most real thing in the world, even when it did not feel like it. Then she had walked out of the room and stood in the hallway for 30 full seconds, breathing in and out, because the breath was the only thing she trusted herself to do without shaking. Down the corridor, the plastic chair squeaked, and the federal agent looked up from his earpiece as the elevator at the end of the hallway opened with a soft, polite chime. 2 more men stepped out, both of them also in dark suits, but there was something different about the way these 2 moved. They were not federal agents. They were something older, something more careful, and the way they scanned the room before they had even stepped fully out of the elevator made the hair at the back of Maya's neck stand up the way it had always stood up when she had been on the wrong side of a perimeter that was no longer safe. The men did not introduce themselves. They walked past the federal agents with the easy, almost bored confidence of men who had been doing this kind of work for a very long time, and the federal agents did not stop them, because the federal agents understood, without being told, that the men who had just arrived were above them in the chain of command that mattered most on a night like this. The lead man, a tall, lean figure with a thin scar running along his jawline and silver threading through his dark hair, walked directly to Maya's station and placed a single, slim folder on the counter in front of her without opening it. The folder contained a photograph of Theo, a recent family photo that showed him standing next to his mother at a holiday dinner, both of them smiling in a way that looked rehearsed and a way that was at the same time real. The folder also contained a short, typed note that said, in plain language, that there was reason to believe the location of this child had been compromised, and that a tactical evacuation was being considered for the morning, but that the morning might be too late. Maya read the note twice. She read it the way she had been trained to read things, slowly, deliberately, searching for the words that were not there, the silences that meant more than the sentences. When she looked up, the tall man with the scar was watching her. He was watching her the way the first federal agent had watched her, but he was watching her longer, deeper, with the half-frown of a man who had once seen a face like hers across a long, dusty table in a country that no longer existed on any official map. He did not say anything. He simply nodded once, slowly, the way you nod at someone you recognize but cannot quite place, and then he turned on his heel and walked back toward the elevator, speaking quietly into his own earpiece the entire way. Maya knew in that moment that the tall man had seen her limp and had seen the way she carried herself, and that somewhere in the deepest part of his memory, he had filed her under a name that was not the name she wore on her name badge. She did not know how he knew. She suspected that there were only 3 or 4 people in the world who would have known, and that he was one of them. She did not ask. She simply slid the folder into the drawer at her side, sealed it shut with the small, brass key she wore on a chain around her neck, and went back to her paperwork. The rain kept falling outside, and the hospital kept breathing its long, slow breath around her. And somewhere on the 4th floor, a young boy slept with the soft, abandoned trust of a child who had finally been told he was safe and had chosen, for now, to believe it. If you have ever believed in someone before you had any proof, take a second to subscribe and ring the bell, because this story was made for the kind of people who believe first and ask questions later. The elevator chimed again at 2:47 in the morning, but this time the sound was followed by a noise that did not belong in a hospital. The noise was the sound of a hard-soled shoe striking a polished floor with the kind of deliberate force that people use when they want you to know they are coming long before they arrive. Maya looked up from her paperwork, and the federal agent at the end of the hallway stood up from his plastic chair in one smooth motion, his hand already moving toward the inside of his jacket. The door to the elevator opened, and 2 more men stepped out, but these 2 were not federal agents, and they were not from the older chain of command. They were wearing long, dark coats that opened just slightly at the front as they walked, and the way they walked, with their hands loose at their sides and their shoulders squared in the way that only men who had spent a long time around violence learned to square their shoulders, told Maya everything she needed to know about them before either of them had opened his mouth. They were not here to visit a patient. They were not here to deliver paperwork. They were here because someone had told them exactly where Theo was, exactly which floor he was on, and exactly which nurse's station would be the easiest one to walk past. The first gangster had a face that was wide and clean-shaven, with a smile that did not reach his eyes, and he walked up to the federal agent at the end of the hallway and asked him, in a polite, almost gentle voice, whether the federal agent would be so kind as to step aside. The federal agent did not step aside. He reached into his jacket for his weapon, and the gangster's smile widened, as if the federal agent had just confirmed something that the gangster had suspected but found amusing all the same. The second gangster, who was taller and leaner, with a thin watch chain glittering faintly at his vest, walked up to the other federal agent, the one standing guard at Theo's door, and asked him in perfect, soft Spanish whether the agent could hear him now. Then he did something Maya had only ever seen done once before, in a hospital room in a country whose name she had been ordered to forget, and he raised one hand and showed the agent the small, silver emblem on the inside of his cuff, the kind of emblem that only certain people carry and only certain people recognize. The emblem of the Alarkan organization, the mark of TH. A cartel that had burned the safe house and beaten a child, and was now standing in a hospital corridor, asking politely for permission to finish what it had started. The gunshot came 3 seconds later, muffled by the thick jacket of the agent who had tried to fire first, and the agent fell against the wall in a slow, terrible way, sliding down to the floor with a soft, scraping sound that made the fluorescent lights above his head seem to flicker in sympathy. Maya heard the shot from across the hallway, and the sound of it traveled through her body, the way rain travels through an old wound, finding every fracture she had ever tried to forget. The second federal agent was shouting into his earpiece, but his voice was already drowned out by the footsteps of the men who were now coming up the stairwell, 4 of them, then 5, each wearing the same long, dark coat, each carrying the same cold, polished weapon tucked close against the ribs. They moved like water through a crack, filling the hallway in less than a minute, taking position by the elevators and the stairwell doors, sealing off every exit with the patient, practiced ease of men who had rehearsed this scene in a warehouse somewhere and had come tonight to perform it for real. If you are still with me, hit subscribe right now, because what is about to happen in the next few minutes is the reason this story was made, and you do not want to scroll away before you see it. Maya did not move. She did not move because moving too soon would have given her away, and she had learned long ago that the most dangerous thing a person could do in a room full of men who believed they owned it was to let those men know that she was watching them with anything more than the empty, frightened eyes of a hospital nurse. So she sat very still at her station, with her pen in her hand and her chart open in front of her, and she watched from behind the soft curtain of her own invisibility as the gangsters moved down the corridor. They did not look at her. They looked at the agents they had already neutralized, at the closed door of Theo's room, at the small, plastic chair where the first federal agent had been sitting. They did not look at her because men who have been raised on violence do not look at the people they think cannot possibly become a threat. They look at the threats they already understand. They look at the weapons they can see. They look at the doors the boy is sleeping behind. The lead gangster, the one with the wide, clean-shaven face, walked up to Theo's door and pressed his ear against the wood. He listened for a long, careful moment, the way a hunter listens to a thicket before stepping into it, and then he nodded slowly to the tall, lean man beside him, and the lean man reached into his coat and pulled out a small, matte black tool that looked like a long, thin key. He inserted it into the lock of Theo's door, and the lock clicked open with the soft, polite sound of a gadget that had been built for exactly this purpose. The lead gangster pushed the door open a few inches, and a thin, pale line of light from inside fell across his face. And Maya, who was watching all of this from 20 feet away through the small gap between the nurse's station and the wall, could see the boy's small, sleeping form in the bed just inside, curled up on his side with one arm tucked under the pillow and the other arm resting on top of the blanket, around a small, stuffed rabbit that had been with him through every move his mother had ever made. Maya knew in the exact moment she saw the stuffed rabbit that she was going to have to do something. The stuffed rabbit was brown, and it had a single missing eye from the time Theo had accidentally dropped it at a hotel pool, and the rabbit's name was Lucas, and Theo had told her this earlier in a voice that had broken her heart into small, quiet pieces. She could not let them take the rabbit away from him by killing him in his own bed. She could not let that happen. She had not crawled out of a burning convoy in a country that did not exist on any map to watch a child lose a stuffed rabbit, because men with rings on their fingers had come to finish what they had started on a quiet October night in a hospital that smelled like antiseptic and rain. So the moment the lead gangster stepped fully into Theo's room, Maya stood up. She stood up slowly, the way a person stands up when their body has been waiting for permission for a long time and has finally been given it. She did not lunge. She did not panic. She did not scream. She simply stood up, and the small brass key around her neck swung gently against the hollow of her throat, and the chart in her hand fell to the floor with a soft, papery slap that the gangsters barely heard because they were already so focused on the room ahead of them. Maya stepped out from behind the nurse's station, and as she did, she reached beneath the bottom drawer of the counter where the den panel had always looked slightly loose, and she pulled out a small, soft bundle that she had wrapped in an old, faded towel 3 years ago when she had taken this job and had told herself she would never need it. The bundle was a long, thin, heavy nothing to anyone who did not know what they were looking at. It was a syringe she had kept for emergencies, the kind of syringe that carried not medicine, but a fast-acting sedative strong enough to drop a 200-pound man in less than 4 seconds. She had not used it in years. She had kept it under the counter because the woman who had once helped her disappear had told her that the day she needed it again, she would know exactly when that day had arrived. She knew. If you have ever stood up for someone who could not stand up for himself, please take a second to subscribe and share this story with a friend who needs to hear it. Maya moved. She moved the way the wind moves through a hallway when the hallway does not expect it, smoothly, without sound, almost graceful. The lead gangster had his back to her as he leaned over Theo's bed, and the second gangster was still at the door, half in and half out, watching the hallway with one hand on his weapon. Maya came up behind the lead gangster in 3 quiet steps, and before he could turn around, she had the syringe pressed against the soft, unprotected fold of skin on the side of his neck. And she depressed the plunger with a calm, certain motion that she remembered from 100 quiet nights in 100 quiet countries, where the people she had been asked to save had sometimes been asleep, and had sometimes been awake, and had never, in any of those years, been anyone she had not loved in a way she could not explain. The gangster stiffened. He did not cry out. He did not have time. He crumpled the way a tree crumples when you saw through the trunk at just the right angle, slowly, almost politely, folding onto the carpeted floor of Theo's room with a soft, surprised sigh that Theo heard in his sleep, and that made him pull the rabbit a little closer to his chest without waking. The second gangster turned at the sound of the sigh, and Maya was already moving. She had pulled a second syringe from the inside of her sleeve, where she had been carrying it since the moment the elevator had chimed at 2:47, and she drove this one into the soft, exposed skin of the gangster's forearm as he raised his weapon. He tried to pull the trigger, and the weapon fired, but the shot went wide and buried itself in the wall just above Theo's pillow, and Theo woke up with a small, choked cry that broke the silence of the room in two. The gangster was already falling. Maya caught him by the lapel of his long coat, lowered him gently to the floor, and stepped over him in one smooth motion that left no footprints and no hesitation. The corridor outside was still lit by the fluorescent lights, and the other gangsters at the end of the hallway had not yet realized that the two men they had sent into the room had gone quiet in a way that no longer made sense. Maya stepped out of Theo's room and closed the door softly behind her, and as she turned the small, brass lock on the door's inside knob, she said very quietly into the small, dark space of the boy's room that she would be back in a minute, and that he should stay in bed, and that Lucas would be okay too. Then she stepped out into the hallway, and the war that had been waiting for her, somewhere under her skin for 7 years, finally let itself out. The first gangster heading down the corridor had his weapon raised, and Maya did not give him time to aim. She crossed the distance between them in a sprint that did not look, to anyone watching from the sidelines, like anything a nurse should be capable of doing. She came in low and angled her shoulder into the center of his chest, and she wrapped her left arm around his wrist and rotated his hand outward with a sharp, clean motion that broke his grip on the weapon and dropped it to the floor with a loud, ringing clatter. She brought her elbow under his chin in a single, decisive arc that lifted him off his feet for a moment and then set him down hard against the plastic chair that had been squeaking all night under the weight of the federal agent who was no longer sitting in it. The gangster's head hit the back of the chair, and he went limp. Maya did not look at him for more than a half-second. She was already moving to the next, and the next, and the next. She took the second one by surprise at the stairwell door, where he had been standing with his weapon pointed down the corridor. She grabbed the back of his coat, spun him, and dropped him with a single, sweeping leg sweep that took out both of his feet at once and sent him sliding across the polished floor with a long, scraping sound that woke up 2 sleeping patients on the floor below. She took the third one at the elevator, where he had been guarding the only remaining point of escape, and she caught him across the jaw with the heel of her palm in a strike that sent his head snapping sideways and his weapon spinning out of his hand and clattering against the elevator's closed doors. She took the fourth one near the corner of the nurse's station, where he had been crouching beside the fallen federal agent, trying to figure out whether the agent was still alive, and she disarmed him with a quick, mechanical motion that she remembered from the very first week of training at the school that had no name and no sign out front. If your heart is racing right now, you are not alone. Hit subscribe and stay with me, because there are 3 more gangsters standing between this nurse and the boy she just promised to protect. The 5th man was the one with the watch chain, the one Maya had clocked the moment he had stepped out of the elevator. He was the liaison. He was the one who carried the messages. He was the one who knew that the rabbit's name was Lucas, and he was the one who had told the men in the warehouse how to get to the 4th floor. He was standing at the far end of the hallway now, and his weapon was aimed directly at Maya's chest, and his finger was already on the trigger, and his eyes were wide and confused in a way that told Maya he was not a fighter. He was a messenger. He was a man who had been told that this would be a quiet, easy job, and that the only obstacle would be 3 federal agents who were already accounted for. He was a man who had not been told that there would be a nurse with a syringe in her sleeve and a limp in her leg, and a long, beautiful, terrifying history hidden under the seams of her uniform. Maya stopped moving. She stood very still, the way she had been trained to stand still in moments when the only way out of a situation was to let the other person make the wrong move first. She raised her hands slowly. She let the man with the watch chain take a long, hard look at her, and she watched, with the quiet patience of someone who had been trained to read the small, frightened flinch of a human hand on a trigger, the moment his finger began to press down. When he fired, Maya had already moved. She had stepped to the side of the shot with a half-second to spare, and the bullet had buried itself in the wall behind her with a soft, dull thud, and she had closed the rest of the distance between them in a single, low sprint that carried her into his chest like a wave. She drove her palm up under his chin, and his head snapped back, and his weapon rose with his arm and went off into the ceiling, and the fluorescent light above his head exploded in a small shower of glass and sparks that rained down around them like tiny, frozen stars. The man fell. Maya caught him before his head could hit the floor. She lowered him almost gently and set his weapon down beside his outstretched hand, the way you set a child's stuffed rabbit back on a bed after the child has fallen asleep. Then she looked up and the hallway was quiet. The fluorescent lights were still buzzing above her head. The rain was still falling outside. The plastic chair at the end of the hallway was still squeaking faintly in the draft, because the air conditioning had been turned up and the chair was empty and no one was there to make it stop. 3 federal agents were lying on the ground, 2 of them bleeding, 1 of them unconscious. 5 gangsters were lying on the ground, 4 of them unconscious, 1 of them with a watch chain that was still glinting faintly under the broken light. Maya stood in the middle of the hallway, breathing slowly, and as she breathed, she realized that she could not feel her hands. They were shaking. They had not shaken in 7 years, and they were shaking now. The tall man with the thin scar down his jawline appeared at the end of the corridor. He had come back. He had come back because he had heard the shots, and he had come back because he had spent his whole life listening for the sound of his people being in danger, and his feet had carried him up the stairwell faster than his mind had been able to make the decision to follow. He looked down the hallway, and his mouth fell open. He looked at the 5 gangsters on the floor, and at the 2 federal agents bleeding near the wall, and at the small, soft bundle of needles and caps lying beside the nurse's station, and at the limp in Maya's leg, and at the way she was standing with her hands half raised, as if she had not yet realized that the danger had ended. He looked at her the way you look at a person you have been looking for 7 years. He looked at her the way you look at someone you had been told was dead, and who has just stepped out of a hospital hallway with 5 unconscious men at her feet. "Maya," he said, very softly, in a voice that did not have any decoration on it at all. "If this story has made your heart beat a little faster, please subscribe right now, because there is more to come, and the next part will change everything you thought you knew about this quiet nurse." Maya did not turn around at first. She was still standing very still, listening to the long, slow inhale of the air coming through the broken ceiling vent. She was listening the way she had been trained to listen, the way she had been trained to listen in the desert and on the ship, and in the little, dusty villages where the children had called her by a name that meant protector in a language she had learned just enough of to say hello. She was listening for anything that might still be wrong. After a long moment, she let out a small breath, and she turned around, and the tall man was standing there, exactly the way she had known he would be, with his hand on his own earpiece, and his eyes full of something she had not seen in them in 7 years. The thin scar along his jaw was the same. The silver threading through his dark hair was the same. The way he stood with his weight slightly on his back foot was the same. The way he had always stood when he was bracing himself for something he did not want to say out loud. "Hello, Marcus," she said. He walked slowly toward her, and when he was about 3 feet away, he stopped, because he had been raised to know that a soldier needs a small, quiet space around them when they come back from the kind of place she had just come back from. He let her have the space. He looked at her for a long moment, and then he said, in a voice that had the same careful, kind tone it had always had when he had been talking to her in the briefing rooms and on the firing lines, and in the long, dark nights between missions where only the 2 of them had been awake. "We thought you were dead," he said. "We thought you were dead for 7 years, Maya. We grieved for you. We held a service for you. Your mother was there. Your father was there. The whole unit was there in the room with the wooden chairs, and I gave the eulogy, and I could not finish the eulogy because I kept waiting for you to walk in and tell me to stop talking and go back to bed." Maya did not answer right away. She looked at the floor, then at the wall, then at the small, battered nurse's station where she had been pretending to fill out paperwork for the last 6 years. She looked at all of it the way you look at a place you have been hiding in for so long that it has become a kind of second skin. Then she looked at Marcus again, and the corner of her mouth moved in a small, tired smile that almost, but not quite, became a real one. Marcus let out a small, soft laugh that had a kind of wetness in it, the kind of wetness that came from a man who had spent 7 years swallowing something he had not been ready to say out loud. He reached out and put his hand on her shoulder, and Maya did not flinch. She had not flinched from anyone's touch in 7 years, because flinching had always been the most expensive thing she could do. And she had stopped being able to afford it the moment she had walked out of the hospital in Virginia with her new name and her limp, and her decision to disappear into a small, faded life in a hospital that smelled like antiseptic and rain. Marcus did not let go of her shoulder for a long moment, and when he finally did, his hand had left a small, warm impression on the fabric of her scrubs, the kind of impression that a hand leaves on a piece of cloth when the hand has been carrying something heavy for a very long time and has finally been allowed to set it down. Marcus nodded slowly, and then he looked down the hallway at the 5 unconscious men on the floor, and his face changed in a way that was not anger and was not sadness, but a third thing, a thing that people who have spent their whole lives in dangerous work recognize when they see it in another person's face. He looked at Maya again, and he said very quietly that he was glad she had not stayed invisible forever. If you have ever felt like you needed to be seen by someone who truly understood you, please subscribe and share this story with someone who deserves to be reminded tonight. The next hour passed slowly, the way an hour passes when the world has just shifted on its axis and is still trying to figure out how to balance itself again. Federal agents poured into the fourth floor within minutes of Marcus's quiet call into his earpiece, and they moved around Maya the way people move around a small fire that has not been put out yet, carefully, with the respectful distance of people who do not quite understand what they are looking at. They secured the unconscious gangsters. They lifted the wounded agents onto stretchers. They brought in a small, soft blanket for Theo, who had been roused gently by a young nurse with a kind voice and who had been given a cup of warm cocoa and a promise that Lucas would be allowed to stay in the bed with him tonight. The boy had looked at Maya when they had finally let her come back into his room, and he had looked at her the way a child looks at a person they have only known for a few hours, but who has somehow, in those few hours, become the most important person in the world. He had looked at her, and he had held out Lucas, and he had asked her in a small, careful voice if Lucas could have a Band-Aid like the one she had given him earlier. Maya had smiled, and she had wrapped a small, soft, white Band-Aid around the rabbit's missing eye, and the boy had smiled back, and the smile had been the first real smile she had seen from him all night. Marcus had called for a tactical transport to take Theo and his mother to a new safe house in a different city. The transport arrived within the hour, a small, unmarked ambulance with darker windows than usual, driven by a woman with a kind face who had been doing this kind of work for so long that she no longer bothered to ask questions about the passengers she carried. Theo had been carried down the hallway in Maya's arms, not because he could not walk, but because he had asked very quietly if she would carry him, and she had said yes, because saying yes had been the only true thing she could say to him in that moment. The boy had fallen asleep against her shoulder on the way down the elevator, and Lucas had fallen asleep against his shoulder, and Maya had walked down the long corridor of the hospital with a sleeping child in her arms and an old weapon under her skin, and a small brass key swinging gently against her throat. And every nurse and doctor and patient and orderly who saw her had stood still, and had watched her go, and had not said a word. Somewhere on the way out, an older janitor who had been mopping the floor near the elevator had stopped his mop, and had lifted his chin at her, the way a man lifts his chin at another man when he wants him to know, without speaking, that he has been seen. Maya had looked at the janitor, and the janitor had looked back at her, and for a small, quiet moment that no one else in the hallway had noticed, they had known each other in a way that strangers sometimes know each other when they have both lived through the same kind of dark. The janitor had nodded once slowly, and Maya had nodded back, and the janitor had gone back to his mop. That was all. That was the most that had ever been said between two people who understood each other, and it had been enough. It had been enough because some things do not need words. Some things only need a small, slow nod from a man holding a mop in a hallway at 3 in the morning. And that nod has to carry the weight of everything that has ever been said and everything that has ever been left unsaid. If the janitor's quiet nod made you feel something, please subscribe and share this story. Some heroes do not even know they are heroes until someone, somewhere, nods at them in a hallway. Marcus walked her to the elevator after the boy had been safely handed off to the transport team, and they stood for a moment in silence as the elevator doors opened and closed again with the polite, patient chime of a machine that does not know what it has just witnessed. Marcus looked at her, and she looked at him, and he asked her, in a low voice that was almost lost under the soft whir of the elevator motor, what she wanted to do next. Maya was quiet for a long time. She was quiet the way a person is quiet when they are finally being asked a question that they have been avoiding for 7 years, and the question is so simple and so small that it has somehow become the most impossible thing in the world to answer out loud. She thought about her small apartment with the leaky roof and the broken radiator. She thought about the night shift and the bad coffee and the senior nurse dolers who always told her she was doing a fine job in a voice that sounded somehow like a lie. She thought about Theo and Lucas and the small, soft Band-Aid she had wrapped around the rabbit's missing eye. She thought about the gunmen on the floor behind her and the blood on the wall, and the long, beautiful history that had just been dragged back into the light of a hallway at 3 in the morning in a hospital that smelled like antiseptic and rain. Marcus nodded. He did not push. He did not ask her to come back. He did not tell her that the world needed her, or that her country needed her, or that the people who had once loved her still needed her in the same old, familiar way. He simply nodded, and he reached out and pressed a single, folded piece of paper into her hand, and the paper had a single phone number written on it in a slow, careful handwriting that was unmistakably his. Then he turned on his heel and walked back down the hallway toward the room where the unconscious gangsters were being processed, and his footsteps were steady, and his back was straight, and his earpiece was already alive with a soft, urgent chatter that was pulling him back into the long, complicated work of a life he had never quite figured out how to leave behind either. Maya stood at the elevator alone. The hospital was quiet. The fluorescent lights above her head had been fixed, and the small, dim bulb that had been flickering above the nurse's station for 5 years was no longer flickering. The rain had stopped. The hallway smelled faintly of disinfectant and coffee and something else, something older, something that she could not quite name but that she understood, deep in the part of her that had been trained to understand the small, invisible things that other people walked past every day without ever noticing. She looked down at the piece of paper in her hand, and then she folded it, and then she tucked it into the small, brass key around her neck, and then she walked back to her nurse's station, and she picked up her pen, and she went back to her paperwork. She did this because she did not know what else to do, and because the paperwork was the only thing that was still hers, and because the senior nurse dolers would be back in 8 hours and would want to see her charts filled out before her shift began. Maya sat quietly in the half-dark of the empty nurse's station, and she listened to the soft, distant hum of the city waking up outside the windows, and she waited for the morning to come. The morning came slowly, the way it always comes in October, with a thin, pale light that crept under the curtains and across the polished floors, and a small, low breeze that carried the last, cold breath of the night. Maya finished her charts. She finished them slowly, carefully, with the same deliberate attention she gave to everything. And when she was done, she set her pen down and she stood up, and she walked out through the long, white hallway of St. Vincent's Hospital, and she did not look back. If you have ever walked away from a place that no longer fit, you already know the most important part of this story. Please take a second to hit the like button, subscribe to our channel, and share this with someone who still believes that people can change, even after 7 years of silence. Somewhere 2 years later, on a warm May morning that smelled of cherry blossoms and new paint, Maya Cross stood on a small wooden stage in the back of a gymnasium in a small town in Virginia, and she watched as a federal agent named Marcus Webb pinned a small, bronze star to the lapel of her uniform. The uniform was not a nurse's uniform. It was not a soldier's uniform. It was a plain, navy blue jacket with a federal insignia stitched into the shoulder, the kind of insignia worn by the people who protect the witnesses the world never sees. The gymnasium was filled with people. The boy Theo was sitting in the second row, and he was 12 now, and his arm was no longer in a cast, and Lucas the rabbit was sitting on the seat beside him, also no longer missing an eye, with a small, faded Band-Aid still wrapped around the place where the missing eye had once been. Theo's mother was sitting in the first row, holding his hand. The senior nurse Dolers was sitting in the third row, and she was crying, and she had come all the way from the hospital on a bus because the bus had been the cheapest way to get to Virginia, and she had wanted to see the woman she had once treated as a ghost receive the only honor she had ever deserved. The janitor was there, too. The janitor had come in a new pair of shoes and a clean shirt, and he was standing near the back of the gymnasium with his hands folded in front of him. The way a man stands when he has been waiting a long time to see something he always knew was going to happen. Marcus pinned the star to Maya's lapel, and he stepped back, and he said, in a voice that was loud enough for the whole gymnasium to hear, that this woman had once been listed as killed in action by the United States government, and that she had walked away from a burning convoy and had chosen a quieter, harder life in a hospital where no one knew her name, and that she had stayed quiet even when the quiet had almost killed her. He said that she had not stayed quiet because she had been afraid. He said that she had stayed quiet because she had been waiting for the right moment. And the right moment had come on a Tuesday in October when a 9-year-old boy had walked into her ward with a small, soft rabbit under his arm and a fire still smoking on the back of his neck. The gymnasium was silent for a long moment. Then Theo stood up, and his mother stood up beside him, and Dolers stood up behind them, and the janitor stood up at the back of the room. And one by one, every person in the gymnasium stood up too, and the room filled with the long, slow, thundering sound of a standing ovation that was not for the bronze star on Maya's lapel, but for the woman who had earned it on a night when no one else had been there to see her earn it. Maya stood very still on the small wooden stage. She did not cry, she did not speak, she simply stood and she listened, and she let the sound of the applause wash over her the way water washes over a stone that has been sitting in the river for a long time, smoothing it, softening it, turning it into something that looks. For the first time in all the years it has been there like it belongs there. She closed her eyes. She thought of the burning convoy. She thought of the soft, kind voice of the medic telling her she was going to be fine. She thought of the brass key around her neck, and the folded piece of paper inside it that had been the only link to a life she had not chosen to leave behind, only chosen to set down for a while. She thought of Theo and Lucas, and the small, soft band-aid she had wrapped around the rabbit's missing eye. She thought of all the small, soft things that had carried her silently through the long, silent years. Then she opened her eyes, and the gymnasium was still full of the sound of the standing ovation, and Marcus was still standing in front of her with his hand extended, and Theo was still holding Lucas in the second row, and Dolores was still crying, and the janitor was still standing at the back of the room with his hands folded in front of him, and the morning was still warm, and the cherry blossoms were still blooming outside the windows, and the world had finally, after 7 long, quiet years, decided to see her. She was not invisible anymore. She had not been invisible for a long time. She stepped forward and she took Marcus's hand, and she shook it with the same steady grip she had always used on a pen, on a weapon, on a syringe, on the small, soft hands of a boy who had once asked her in a small voice whether safe was a real thing. She had not known the answer then. Standing in the gymnasium on that warm May morning with the bronze star still cool against the fabric of her lapel, she knew the answer. Safe was not a place. Safe was not a building. Safe was not the absence of danger, or the presence of a guard, or the silence of a hallway in the middle of the night. Safe was the choice to stand up for someone, even when standing up was the most terrifying thing you had ever done. Safe was the choice to be seen, even when being seen had cost you everything you had ever hidden behind. Maya smiled. It was the first real smile she had given in 7 years, and the smile was wide and it was soft, and it was not the smallest, cheapest smile she had been using to keep the world from sliding off her back for as long as she could remember. It was a real smile. It was her smile. And it was the kind of smile that a child sees once and never, ever forgets. Thank you for staying with us until the very end. If this story meant something to you, please like, subscribe, and share it with someone who has always believed in the quietest person in the room. Until next time.